I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak about the issue of culture and identity, an issue that's very close to my heart, but also in the context of global relations. And hopefully I can spark a similar amount of discussion than my predecessor, who certainly managed to have everyone thinking this morning, and I hope debating for the rest of the week. I come from Scotland, and I am fiercely proud to be Scottish. I am not a nationalist. I am very wary of nationalists in many respects, and nationalism. But I am certainly patriotic. And while I am partly British, and I am certainly partly European, and I hope that I exhibit some of the good characteristics I would expect in a global citizen, first and foremost, I am Scottish, and I treasure that identity and associate with my culture very, very closely. Indeed, very proud of our history, perhaps in two important respects. First of all, we were the only country in those parts of Europe, Greater Europe, that the Romans attempted to invade, where they were not successful. In fact, they had to build a wall to keep us in. The Hadrian's Wall was not built by the Scots to keep the Romans out. It was built by the Romans to ensure the Scots stayed behind the wall, and the wild hordes of Gaels at that time were contained. But also when we voluntarily, rightly or wrongly, voluntarily joined the Union of the United Kingdom back in 1707, we retained three important elements of our own independence and national culture and identity. One was our national church, the second was our national legal system, and the third was our national education system, which at that time was the most comprehensive and locally organised in the world. And they have been important, very important elements, so that 300 years on, the Scottish identity still remains very strong, the Scottish pride remains strong, and although the majority of Scots would regard themselves as Scottish and British, they do first and foremost regard themselves as Scottish, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, recognising the importance of those institutions and that history. I've had the incredible honour and privilege to be part of the now 30-year movement to create the new parliament that we have in Scotland. My very first vote, cast in 1979, was cast in a referendum to create a devolved parliament in Scotland and an autonomous parliament for Scotland within the UK. On that occasion, unsuccessful. Having vowed to spend my life trying to reverse that decision, I had the pleasure to become First Minister, as Mark has said. But I've also, in the last 18 months, spent a considerable amount of my time working on peace building, both at the United Nations, across Africa, and indeed in other continents, taking part in events such as this one. And I have some very strong views about the nature of cultural diplomacy, partly because I spoke here in November and I've been thinking about it ever since, about the nature of international institutions. And I want to really make the case this afternoon now, for us to think not just in terms of thinking globally and acting locally, a phrase that was used earlier this morning, but also thinking locally and acting globally, which I regard as equally as important. And I say that for a number of reasons. The creation of the United Nations had many purposes, and one of those purposes was obviously to try and eliminate the scourge of war for future generations. And I think if we look back over the last 50 years, there are many, many positives obviously in our world in that time, but I think some of the more depressing observations might be that roughly the same power balance exists in our world, and certainly inside the United Nations today, as existed back at its creation. The structures have never really been reformed to reflect the changing nature of our world, and the power balance remains roughly similar. The world order of colonisation, as it was then, has been replaced in roughly similar, not a similar relationship between the countries of the north and the countries of the south, but in an equally damaging, in my view, relationship of dependency rather than colonisation. And while the UN, and to some extent the EU, of course, here in Europe, have resulted in prosperity and security for the developed world over that time, as a result of many different factors, the UN and the international institutions and the international community has totally failed to provide security and reduce conflict in the developing world over that time. In many cases, those who live in the developing world have lived with the other side of the coin, while the rest of us have been enjoying that prosperity and security. The majority of people in the developing world have faced instability, insecurity, conflict, and poverty. And I think resolving conflict, resolving the issues behind conflict, ensuring that we have sustainable peace and we have successful post-conflict reconstruction in those countries that have suffered from conflict in that time, is the most important, the greatest development challenge of our time, and one that we can address partly by thinking locally and partly by acting globally. And I think this requires a fundamental shift in our thinking. And I'm glad we're going to have a question and answer session, because I worry sometimes that we pick up the nuances of what we say, the themes, and we interpret them in different ways. The use of language, even in a conference that uses the English language throughout, can be a challenge. I was a school teacher before I was First Minister, and I used to enjoy visiting schools when I was First Minister, particularly opening new school buildings, always a favourite of politicians. And when I was, my very last school building that I opened before the election that I very narrowly lost in 2007, was a beautiful new building, a huge school. And after the fantastic ceremony where everybody looked brand shining new, including the pupils and the parents and the staff, I was taken to the headmaster's room for a radio interview, and there was one young boy sitting outside the door of the headmaster's room. And I don't know what happens in your countries, but in our country, if you're sitting outside the headmaster's room, you've been in some sort of trouble that morning, and you're waiting for your punishment. So I instinctively stopped as a former teacher, and if I'm being honest, was the adrenaline was flowing after the morning session, and I stopped and in a moment of madness said to this young boy, "What are you doing there?" And he didn't look up, he kept his head down, and he muttered something to himself. And so I thought I'll pursue the point, and I said, "Have you been in trouble this morning?" And he looked up at me and he said, "Yes, I'm sorry, I've been in trouble this morning." And I thought, well, I'm not a school teacher, so I can't give him this punishment. So what can I do? And I thought I'll say something threatening and might worry him in the future. So I said, "Do you realise that I am in charge of all the prisons in Scotland?" And he looked up at me with a smile on his face and a mark of recognition and said, "You will know my big brother well then." If that doesn't translate, he was anticipating, because his big brother was in the prisons and had been in a few, that I would know him well. So the use of language between he and I had become distorted. So if anything I say is not clear, please use the question in the discussion session to check it. But I want to make the case for a fundamental shift in our thinking. Almost everything that I have read about cultural diplomacy since I attended the conference back in November has talked about the importance of cultural diplomacy and soft power for the developed world. We have welcomed the fact that President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton talk more about soft power than hard power, more than any of their predecessors have ever done before. A great change at the start of the 21st century. We talk about the importance today of cultural relations, of building links, of other countries understanding us better. And I want to make the case this morning for looking at that the other way around. I think we're not going to change global relations, and we're not going to succeed in building a new, more successful world order and a more secure and peaceful world unless we understand and respect the cultures of others more successfully and more thoroughly. I say that for a whole number of reasons, but I've come across a whole range of examples over recent months. I was in Guinea-Bissau in January, in West Africa, small West African state, almost permanently embroiled in conflict, very badly governed, although I think the current government is trying genuinely to change things. And those Europeans and UN representatives from a range of countries, including developing countries who were there, were complaining about the fact that a peace agreement signed 18 months ago hadn't quite fully been implemented yet. And I had to point out to them that the first peace agreement in Northern Ireland, in the UK, and one of the world's oldest democracies, was first signed 12 years ago. We had the first ceasefire 25 years ago, and yet just that week there was a bombing at a police station in Northern Ireland, and a small number of people still trying to upset the equilibrium in the new democracy that was being formed there. Our expectations of other countries, particularly countries in the developed world, of other cultures, of other identities in the developed world, I think, are skewed, are wrong, and are, on occasion, far too regularly on occasion, patronising and lacking in a depth of understanding. I think cultural diplomacy, if it's to mean anything, has to be a two-way process. It has to be about us understanding the rate of change, the speed of change, the potential for change, the reasons behind forms of governance, the reasons behind actions and relationships in other places. We, the Europeans, created a completely artificial, interesting to hear, I suppose, from the other angle, the description of the creation of an artificial European state by the previous speaker. We, the European nations, created dozens and dozens of artificial states in Africa when we divided up Africa between the European colonising countries back just over 100 years ago. It is not surprising that 100 years on and 40 years on from independence for those countries, that the cultures, the identities and the borders are being challenged and find it difficult at times to govern successfully in the modern world. And we need to understand those challenges, that history, and the impact that it has had. And I think we also need to understand the positives. It is increasingly the case, and I think one of the questions this morning made the point about the oil production in Latin America resulting in perhaps a greater regional cohesion, regional leadership. I think it was you. And that was a new development, and actually perhaps a welcome development from a potentially worrying situation. And I have to say that I think there is now an increasing tendency, both in Latin America, also in Africa, and in the different regions of Asia, for regional leadership to develop. And one of the things I want to say today is that I think that is perhaps where the future should lead us in terms of international organisation, that global institutions, global organisations need to be regionally organised if they're to be more successful, rather than organised at the centre in New York or anywhere else. I think you live, most of you here are much younger than me, live in extremely exciting times to be involved in international relations. I think that the commitment of the US administration and increasingly others to soft power has huge potential to change the way that international relations and global relations function in practice. I think the continuing conflict in Afghanistan is forcing countries that would not normally talk to each other, would not normally work together, to look at how they can avoid a situation occurring there that develops and continues for decades, which it has the potential to do. And the relationships building between the neighbours of Afghanistan and those countries elsewhere who, rightly or wrongly, perceive to have an interest in the international terrorism that was believed to have come, if I can put that as neutrally as possible, from that part of the world. I think those relationships, again, have great potential. The economic crisis has forced that part of the world order to start changing already. The fact that Brazil and Indonesia and others are sitting at the top table as part of the G20 discussions is a remarkable change that seemed impossible just 3 years ago, but and a pipe dream in the heads of a few politicians and other visionaries, and today has actually started to happen and will become a permanent feature and will ultimately change the United Nations as well. And the growth of the internet, while I do have some worries about the global community, and I want to refer to them, that in 15 years the internet has completely changed those global relationships too. And I think allows us for the first time, certainly the first time in my lifetime, to genuinely believe that the knowledge gap, which leads in many ways to the education gap, which itself leads in many ways to the income gap and the prosperity gap across our world from between north and south, that knowledge gap can be closed much more easily than if we had to rely on the old ways of learning and passing on knowledge that existed before. I heard I think yesterday that there are 500 million people currently registered with Facebook. Now that is inconceivable. 5 years ago, never mind 15 years ago. And that kind of international connection can only make our world a better place in terms of understanding and celebrating diversity rather than fear and uncertainty. But within that, there are other changes happening too. And it was interesting to hear, again, what the previous speaker was saying about the European Union. I think one of the most significant international events of the last 12 months was the fact that the inadequate deal that was reached at the end of the Copenhagen talks in December, was reached without the European Union being in the room. 10 years ago, it was Margaret Wallström, the European Union's Environment Commissioner, who led the talks in Kyoto to a conclusion and forced the pace. 10 years on, when President Obama sat down with 4 or 5 countries and basically struck the deal that then became the next step, the European Union weren't even at the table. And there's another way in which our world is changing, and an exciting time for international relations. I want to just make one point about identity and then 3 brief points that might be things that you can take away. I think the celebration of individual identities and collective identities is very, very important. I do not adhere to the idea of European citizenship. I believe I'm partly European, and I believe in European-wide action where it's appropriate. I don't adhere to the idea that we will all become some sort of amorphous global citizens someday. I think people have identities for all sorts of historical reasons, and that those identities, the recognition of those identities, is really, really important for people in an increasingly insecure and threatening world. And I think it is the role of those who aspire to take global action to celebrate the diversity of identity and not to try and suppress it. I think the 3 points I would want to make are, first of all, that I think the process of globalisation, this may be a very obvious point to make to everybody in this room, but the process of globalisation brings with it real global responsibilities on the part of those who have power already. And those responsibilities do not just mean a responsibility from the north to the south, but they also mean a responsibility from those in power now to those who will follow us in the future. And I think if short-termism is a problem in national governments and in national decision-making across the world, then from my experience, particularly over the last 18 months, being involved in the issue of peace building and related issues as well, I think short-termism in international relations is also a serious problem for us too. The desire on the part of national leaders coming together in international summits to get a statement that ends the summit with a good headline and not to follow it through or to look to the longer term implications further down the road, I think is very, very damaging for long-term sensible decision making about the way in which the global community can close gaps in income and security for future generations. I really hope that there will be those in the global leadership of today who will look to where the world needs to be in 50 years' time, not where it needs to be in 5 months' time or even just 5 years' time. What kind of United Nations, what kind of global organisation, what kind of institutions, what kind of society are we trying, or societies are we trying to help create and ensure that they can function successfully? I don't believe that thinking is going on at the moment. I think national governments, national leaders, pressurised by national media, pressurised by time and other priorities, revert far too often to short-term decision-making that gets them across the next hurdle. And the same way as they do that at home, they do it internationally as well. And there is a strong, strong need for us to take those global responsibilities into a longer-term debate of where we want to be. The second point I want to make is that increasingly in the last 10 years, those who have been committed to international development and to the developed world providing more support in a more positive and a more sustainable way to the developing world have talked, and actually also those who've been committed to action on climate change and action on international security and peace, have framed their debate in terms of national self-interest in addition to global justice. They've done that in order to persuade their own populations and to persuade developed countries that were reluctant to get involved in those kinds of international initiatives. I actually think the balance has gone too far now in that direction. And I think there is a desperate need for people globally to make the case not just that a world that is less divided economically, a world that is less threatened by climate change, a world that is less threatened by conflict, is good for our own self-interest in the developed world and individual countries, but it is also right. It is just. And I think in this century we should be able to make the case for justice on that front rather than simply self-interest, and we need to rebalance that debate accordingly. And the third thing I want to say, and I make this point because of the audience, really, because I think most of you are going to be involved in diplomacy or international relations or academic work or professional work in that capacity over the next decade or so. I find the growth of regional organisation both exciting and also really, really encouraging in terms of its practical potential. Someone said at an event I spoke at earlier on this year that if you have a fire in your house, before the fire engine arrives, you turn to your neighbours to give you some assistance. And across the world, countries that are coming out of conflict or trying to prevent conflict instinctively should be able to, and where they can turn to their neighbours first for support and assistance. It is undoubtedly the case that despite tensions and all kinds of problems in West Africa over the last 9 months, that the growth of ECOWAS, the economic community of West Africa, West African states, and its role politically in trying to stop unconstitutional manoeuvres by governments in West Africa, has reduced the likelihood in a number of different countries of presidents going for third terms when they should stop after 2, or coup d'etats taking place and violence taking place where it could be avoided. And it's undoubtedly the case that the South American community, now becoming increasingly organised, has the capacity, for a whole range of reasons, to play a bigger role globally as well as regionally in Central America, but play a bigger role globally in contributing an affinity to international discussions and diplomacy that perhaps cannot be provided by Europeans or North Americans. And it is undoubtedly the case that regional organisations in Asia, I think, will do far, far more to try to reduce the incidence of internal violence or repression that we have seen even in recent years in some Asian states than the international community will ever either be prepared to do or could do successfully. And I think if the United Nations is going to develop over the next 50 years, if we're going to look to the post-Cold War world, potentially the post-war against terror world, the post-economic crisis of the early 21st century world, if we're going to develop a United Nations, an international framework in which we operate, then I think the developed countries who provide international aid and assistance and have political power at the moment should be looking to really significantly build both the capacity and the power and the voice of the regional organisations in Africa, in Latin America and Asia, in the Gulf and elsewhere, so that we have a balance throughout the world of not just more voices who can contribute to international debate in a more balanced way, but also can assist and deal with, and particularly prevent problems occurring inside those regions in a way that the United Nations has been unable to do, largely for the last 50 years. So I'll leave it on that point. That's, I hope, a point in which perhaps even future conferences of the ICD can focus, and hopefully a practical point as well as a theoretical point about the nature of international organisations, but one that would allow the recognition of cultures and identities, rather than the suppression of cultures and identities in global relations, in a way that I think would be very positive for the future. Thank you.